captioning. Thank you so much. Test conclusive. Thank you.
protect those who speak out, and uphold the principles of undrip. Colleagues, these are complex and challenging times, but they are also times of opportunity. Our collaboration and coordination are more crucial than ever. Together, we must ensure that Indigenous peoples' voices remain central in all UN processes, that our rights are protected, and that commitments in the declaration are realized in practice. I look forward to our continued cooperation and to aligning our efforts for maximum impact. Hoyan Naming. Thank you.
Thank you for your statement, Madam Chair of the Permanent Forum. I'll now give the floor to Jane Merues, Member of the Board of Trustees of the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. You have the floor.
Madam Chair of the UN Expert Mechanism on the Right of Indigenous People, Madam Chair of the UN Permanent Forum on the Indigenous Issues, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right of Indigenous People, representative of Indigenous peoples, and the civil society organization, Your Excellencies, friends, and colleagues. It is both an honor and profound responsibility to address you today. On behalf of the Board of Trustees of the Voluntary Fund for Indigenous People, Madam Chair, from the onset, let me extend a warm welcome to our 13 Indigenous grantees of the fund who are participating in this year's session of the expert mechanism. Their presence enrich our discussions and underscore the vital importance of Indigenous voices in this meeting. And as we mark historic milestone to the 40th anniversary of the UN Voluntary Fund of Indigenous People, for 4 decades, this fund has served as a vital bridge connecting Indigenous voices from the most remote communities to the whole of global decision-making. Since 1985, this fund has been more than financial mechanism. It has been a catalyst for change, enabling over 4,000 Indigenous representatives over 90 nations to bring their wisdoms, struggles, and solutions to the UN most critical human rights discussions. What began as a modest initiative has grown into transformation force, expanding its mandates to meet emerging challenges, yet always remaining rooted to one unwavering purpose: to ensure Indigenous voices are not just heard, but headed. Madam Chair, it is with this great pride that I present our 2024 impacts. 188 Indigenous representatives from 55 countries were empowered to shape global policy across 20 UN meetings and processes. These figures represent more than numbers. They reflect the voices of 100 women's leaders, 82 men's, and 6 LGBTQ plus advocates. Each bring their lived experiences from every corner of the world into this hall of powers. Without this fund, their voice would remain unheard in spaces where decisions about their lives are made. Through their participation, they are transformed from victim of human rights violation to powerful advocate for justice, turning local struggle into global action. Madam Chair, the fund's impact extends far beyond logistical support. It builds power by equipping Indigenous participants with the knowledge, skills, and confidence to shift from mere attendees to influence advocates. In 2024 alone, we facilitated 17 training sessions, 15 virtual, and 2 in person, reaching over 2,500 Indigenous leaders across all 7 Indigenous sociocultural regions and covering key UN mechanisms like the Human Rights Council and the climate negotiations. Our approach is both global and inclusive, leveraging online platforms for accessibility, ensuring presence in critical decision-making spaces like Geneva and New York, and collaborative closely with Indigenous organizations and UN experts to maximize its impact. Madam Chair, behind every successful training sessions lies the power of partnerships. The fund's groundbreaking annual training calendar, aligned with key UN processes, was not built alone. It is the result of deep collaboration with Indigenous organizations, civil society partners, and UN mechanisms who understand precisely what our communities and need to engage effectively on the global stage. We extend our deepest gratitude to our inevitable partners, including Niatero, DOSIP, Project Access, EMRIP, undrip, UNDP, and many others for co-organizing the fund's training. These expertise dedications and share commitments to empowering Indigenous change makers have been essential in driving meaningful impacts. Together, we are advancing inclusive, transformative advocacy worldwide. Despite its transformative impact on global Indigenous advocacy, the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous People face a severe funding gap, receiving over 6,000 annual applications by supporting only 150 to 170 participants, less than 3% of the request. This disparity between overwhelming demand and stagnant resources means 97% of qualified applicants are turned away, leaving countless urgent needs unaddressed. Climate solution unheard, cultural heritage sites unprotected, and human rights violation unchallenged. As the fund mandate and expand, the need for greater support has never been more crucial like today. Madam Chair, this year marks a historic milestone, the 40th anniversary of the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous People. For decades of amplifying more than 4,000 Indigenous voices at the highest level of the global decision-making, 40 years of transforming local struggle into international action. As we celebrate the legacy, we face a critical choice. Will we mere honor the past, or will we invest in the future? This is a call to action. The demand proves the model's work. Now we must match it with the resources. Today, I issue a heartfelt appeal to all governments. Join us in writing the next chapter of this vital work. The fund ability to continue its mission depends entirely on sustained generosities of our partners. We are profoundly grateful to our 2024 donors, governments, the government of Australia, Canada, Finland, Estonia, Mexico, New Zealand, Norway, Peru, and the Philippines, whose support has made this anniversary possible. Madam Chair, this year has also marked groundbreaking shift in our collective efforts. For the first time in our 40-year of history, visionary philanthropics and civil society partners, the Christian Fund, Niatero, and the DOSIP have joined our mission, bringing fresh energies and innovative to this vital work. but the work is far from finished. These pioneering partners show what's possible when we work differently. We celebrate this commitment today and invite others to join this growing movement for change. Lastly, Madam Chair, once again, I wish to express my sincere appreciation for the opportunity to address this distinguished mechanism, as well as we reflect on the fun 4 decades of service and the critical work ahead. Let us reaffirm our shared commitment to meaningful Indigenous participation in the United Nations system. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your statement. We are very honored to have here a member of the treaty monitoring bodies, the United Nations Human Rights Committee. I'll now give the floor to Yvonne Donders, a member of the Human Rights Committee. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you very much, Chair. Experts, colleagues, friends, excellencies, it's an honor to be here, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share some of the information of the work of the Human Rights Committee in relation to Indigenous peoples' rights. And I hopefully also can encourage you to work closely with us. Now, I've prepared a presentation also because as a university professor, that is what we do. But it's also to give you the concrete information that is easier to follow on a screen than when I mention things. Next slide, please. So let me start by saying that the Human Rights Committee is the monitoring body of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is one of the many human rights treaties. And this particular treaty includes several relevant provisions on human rights for Indigenous peoples. Article 17 on respect for privacy, family and home, the right to political participation. Of course, as was mentioned already, non-discrimination. But most relevant, I would say, are Article 1 on the right of peoples to self-determination, and Article 27, the rights of minorities to enjoy their culture, practice their religion, and enjoy and their own religion and culture. Now, this is a treaty that is a general treaty, a general human rights treaty, and that is not automatically fit for some of the Indigenous peoples' issues. So what we need, and what we therefore are very grateful for, is input from other parts of the United Nations system, such as the expert mechanism, the special rapporteur, who inform us about how to apply this particular treaty for Indigenous peoples, and to adapt some of the language of the ICCPR in that respect. Next slide, please. So the Human Rights Committee has 2, broadly speaking, tools to do this. We have a state reporting procedure whereby states every about 8 years have to report to our committee on how they implement this treaty. Then we gather, and again, I look for your support, NGO, civil society organization information from national human rights institutes, from all of you, and also information from the United Nations. Based on that, we have a dialogue with the states parties here in Geneva. And after that, we adopt our so-called concluding observations, which are recommendations to state on how to implement the treaty. Apart from that, we have individual communications, individuals who submit their complaints on alleged violations of the treaty to us. This is a written procedure, and it's ended when we have decided with what we call a view. The 2 procedures are complementary in a way, because whereas the state reporting procedure is more generally about policies, trends, positive or negative, this is different from an individual complaint, which is really about an individual situation. But both, I think, are important and have been relevant for Indigenous peoples all over the world. Next slide, please. So to give you some examples of where we did include Indigenous peoples' issues and rights in our concluding observations. We talk a lot about effective and meaningful participation And since a number of years, we indeed use the proper language of free, prior, and informed consent. We talk about freedom of expression and the right to demonstrate, because very often we see cases of indeed arbitrary arrests in cases of demonstrations. We talk about protection of human rights defenders, which also include, of course, indigenous peoples' rights defenders or environmental rights defenders. We give the states recommendations on demarcation, access, and use of land. And we talk about, for instance, intersectional discrimination and violence, in particular against indigenous women. Now, what has helped us in being able to interpret our treaty in light of indigenous peoples' rights is, of course, the United Nations Declaration. We often refer to it, and it had helped us to foster more interpretation of self-determination, collective rights, as well as free, prior, and informed consent. Next slide, please. Now, there's also quite some jurisprudence of the Human Rights Committee on indigenous peoples. First of all, it is important to highlight that Article 1 on self-determination is excluded from individual communications. This is a, you could say, quite formalistic way in which we distinguish between the collective group rights in Article 1, distinguish that from the individual complaints procedure. However, over the last years, we see increasingly that we use Article 1 and self-determination as a source of interpretation, as a source of inspiration to interpret the other articles in the Covenant. And of course, the one that has been most used in cases is Article 27, which is on minorities. However, because there is no particular provision on indigenous peoples, it has been used by indigenous peoples, and we have consistently stated that, of course, the rights in that provision also apply to indigenous peoples. And that the concept of culture should be seen as broad as a particular way of life that is also associated with land and resources, especially in relation to indigenous peoples. As I said, we interpret Article 27 increasingly in light of Article 1 and the undrip, including free, prior, and informed consent and a collective dimension. Next slide, please. As was already mentioned by Mr. Chair, indeed recently, in May 25, we adopted a view on a case of several indigenous peoples against Guatemala. These peoples had been forcefully displaced during Operation Scorched Earth in 1980s. The state recognized that, recognized it as a human rights violation, even a crime against humanity, and settled for all kinds of measures and repair measures, including resettlement and construction of alternative housing. However, this has never been implemented. We indeed got third-party interventions, among which from the expert mechanism, for which we were extremely grateful, because some of the issues that came up in that case, we need particular knowledge on those issues. For instance, the transgenerational aspect of indigenous people's rights. Next slide. Our conclusion was therefore that there was a violation of Article 12 because the victims were violently uprooted from their traditional land and forced to seek refuge in the capital city. There was also a violation of Article 27 because victims were forced to change their cultural identities. They had to abandon their practices, stop wearing their traditional clothing, and stop speaking their language. Then it was also a violation of Article 7 because they had to leave behind buried bodies of relatives and were unable to perform funeral rituals. And as we realized, funeral rites are not only performative ceremonies, but an integral part of the physical, moral, and spiritual integrity of the members of the community and of the community as such. What we have emphasized is indeed the intergenerational dimension of this particular case, because this was not only a matter of the people at that time displaced, but also of their children, their grandchildren, because it was not only about displacement, but about cultural identity to be passed on to next generations. All this to say that these cases are important, but what can they lead to? And unfortunately, sometimes they not lead to much follow-up at the national level. And this is again where I reach out to you. There have been cases on several indigenous peoples in the world, and please try to see if you can follow up with those also at the national level. This is not always successful. Just yesterday, the day before yesterday, we heard that one of our other famous cases, Billy versus Australia, was also dealt with in national courts, in the federal court in Australia, but the federal court, for some technical legal reasons, but still denied that the state had a duty of care to protect the Torres Strait Island people against climate change. That was a disappointment. There will probably be other cases, but we hope that by also giving our part of that, we can help some of the indigenous people's rights to move forward. I thank you very much for your attention.
I thank you, the member of the UN Human Rights Committee, Yobon Donders. Colleagues, before I invite the speakers, I'd like to check with my EMRIP colleagues if there are any members want to take the floor. Do we have overwhelming numbers of speakers registered under this agenda item? So I would like to request anyone who take the floor, if you can consider your statement precise and to the point. Your statement finishing 2 minutes, giving 1 minute, it may also help accommodating other speakers at least to hear what they say. So please be kind. Now I'd like to invite EMRIP members to take the floor. I recognize Cheryl Lightfoot, no? Ojot Miru Ojolo, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and let me take this opportunity to thank the panelists for their updates and valuable comments on how we can enhance our cooperation and coordination. Beyond the formal coordination mechanisms, I would like to acknowledge the importance of informal exchange and update among the mechanisms. Particularly, I would like to commend Mr. Special Rapporteur on your reference and acknowledgement of EMRIP's work in different virtual platforms that we've met. I think that's really appreciated and goes in the way of cooperation and coordination. Let me also acknowledge and thank the Voluntary Fund for keeping us in the loop in some of the events happening in our respective regions. I think this needs to be acknowledged as well. And the same is true for the Permanent Forum and the Human Rights Committee treaty bodies as well. I want to acknowledge that your recommendations and concluding observations have been playing a very important role in our respective work to advance and implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So, Mr. Chair, I want to acknowledge this informal exchange and existing good practices and call for their continuation and strengthening. I thank you.
Thank you. Cheryl Lightfoot, following by Annexa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm going to be extremely brief to provide maximum time for speakers, but I did also want to extend my thanks to all of the other mechanisms for your collaborative work and for being here today and sharing. And an extra special thanks to the Human Rights Committee for joining us. We've had you here multiple times now, and quite frankly, I think this engagement is incredibly valuable to moving forward implementation. So I want to thank you for spending the time with us, engaging, sharing the news of the case that you did. We are very, very delighted to play a role in that. And we look forward to continued interaction, not only with Human Rights Committee, but other treaty bodies. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Annexer Alfred Cunningham.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to thank the panel of experts warmly for your participation in this round table. I would sincerely like to appreciate your commitment, generosity, efforts that have brought more visibility to progress achieved and illustrate the challenges that we face in guaranteeing the rights of indigenous peoples. Apologies. I would also like very much before this body to say a few brief words about indeed the challenges that we face. It's vital that they are clearly described. Indigenous peoples are facing the loss of their lands and natural resources due to agricultural activities, mining and urban expansion without any recognition of their rights or recognition of their ancestral homes. We need clarity wherever laws are put in place. Official consultation is needed on the impacts, and we need binding legislation. Racism persists, nourishing negative stereotypes, boosting exclusion and limiting participation in power sharing circles. And culturally, we see that ancestral knowledge and languages are being lost due to the promotion of educational systems that do not place value on indigenous knowledge. They must have access to not just healthcare, but drinking water of sufficient quality. We must not forget the disproportionate impact of climate change on different territories and ways of life, the exclusion of indigenous peoples in the development of strategies and for mitigation and adaptation. What about the defenders of rights of indigenous peoples? They face prosecution, violence, threats, where they're simply trying to help people protect their culture and native lands. The High Commissioner for Human Rights said this during the opening. There are indigenous people who now face disproportionate impacts, and we see a total impunity. There are major challenges to bringing people into decision making, but the voices of all peoples must be heard. Recognizing the challenges that are faced is the first stage in overcoming those challenges, and that is why we would like to thank each of the experts for their honest, rigorous clarity and for their concrete, precious recommendations. Once again, I would like to reaffirm our own commitment, and we are ready to turn words into action to ensure that rights of indigenous people are truly respected under the respective mandates, but also under the covenants and promises for the rights of indigenous peoples. I'd like to talk first of all about the commitment on the Special Trust Fund. What measures have been taken to guarantee participation by indigenous people in countries where persecution and criminalization are clear and evident processes, because indigenous peoples have not been able to participate through the Special Trust Fund. And I think that exclusion is not the best approach, to say the least. I would like to thank the committee for all of their work. Thank you for your work in the spirit of cooperation with the expert mechanism. This is a vital, precious approach, which I think can be repeated with other treaty bodies. Thank you very much.
Colleagues, friends, and delegates, you want to pro? Okay, Antonina Gorbaneva.
Также попытаюсь быть очень краткой.
Well, I also will try to be very succinct. I understand that we have a long list of people who want to speak. I'd like to hail my colleagues, the Special Rapporteur, the Volunteer Fund, but also I'd like to welcome the Human Rights Committee and note that also that there could be an excellent practice if other treaty bodies and this human rights body could use our own thematic research, our reports, our expert documents on realizing the rights of indigenous peoples, but also the technical recommendations that are to be drawn up as a result of country missions and interaction with country offices. And it's particularly important in reviewing the periodic reports on the execution of their obligations under international covenants and treaties on human rights. That would be a good way forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other colleagues would like to take the floor? If not, so I'd like now to turn to the list of speakers. With due respect to everyone, may I request that can you please make a precise statement to the point and saving some time for other colleagues so that we will able to accommodate others because there are overwhelming number of speakers in the list. I also like to request to hold your applause until the end of the item. We'll celebrate this applause end of the item when we finish it. So now I would like to give the floor to Australia.
And also to the panel members. 70% of the world's 250 million indigenous peoples live in our region of Asia and the Pacific Islands and are home to the world's most diverse range of indigenous cultures. Since I started my role, I've had the honor of connecting with many of our Pacific family on both their traditional homelands and more across the various regional and multilateral forums. These visits highlighted the unique cultural connections between indigenous peoples of our lands and waters and the peoples of the Blue Pacific and across the globe. These visits have also demonstrated the strength and contribution of indigenous peoples across our region and the role they play in addressing some of the most pressing challenges of our time, including climate change. I echo the call made by Australia with our Pacific family on the 30th of June during the 59th session of the Human Rights Council, that the international community must respond to the human rights threats posed by climate change and sea level rise, and reaffirming the preservation of the maritime boundaries and continuity of statehood. Global climate action must be rapid, sustained and transformative, and it must be gender responsive and empower youth and children. The principles UNDRIP should underpin our approach and address these challenges. And since its endorsement in 2009, Australia has worked to translate those principles into tangible actions. We recognise that implementing UNDRIP is an ongoing process of improvement and learning that must be undertaken through genuine partnerships between governments and Indigenous peoples. These partnerships can be catalysts for self-determination, cultural respect, and improved life outcomes for Indigenous peoples. They provide opportunities to embed traditional knowledges and practices while facilitating alignment between the priorities of governments and the priorities of local communities. The Australian Government's Indigenous Ranger Program and its school-based equivalent Junior Ranger Program, whereby traditional knowledge and cultural practices are combined with Western science methods to manage land and sea, are examples of what is achievable when Indigenous peoples have a say in the design and delivery of policies and programs. Last year, following intensive consultation, the Australian Government released a landmark First Nations Clean Energy Strategy, providing a framework for how Indigenous Australians, government and industry can work together to guide the investment and partnership during Australia's clean energy transition. Chair, Australia remains committed to continuing this important work. In the spirit of reflection and learning, Australia welcomes ongoing engagement with EMRIP and other mechanisms advancing the rights of Indigenous peoples as we continue our reconciliation journey. Thank you.
Thank you for your statement. Now I give the floor to Rochelle Diver, International Indian Treaty Council.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am delivering this statement on behalf of the International Indian Treaty Council and the Society of Native Nations, and with the full support of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Plastics, the formal Indigenous caucus for the emerging UN Treaty on Plastics Pollution, including the marine environment. We are in an urgent and dire situation as we prepare for the final meeting of the intergovernmental negotiating body set to take place in less than 3 weeks from 5 to 14 August. Unfortunately, the current text, known as the chair's text, has removed all mention of the rights of Indigenous peoples and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, leaving only references to obtaining our Indigenous peoples' knowledge without mention of our free, prior, and informed consent. Additionally, our direct and meaningful participation has not been supported. We've had little to no access to contact groups and reached day 4 in negotiations before we were able to address the plenary. And that intervention was only able to be delivered after our caucus risked everything and had an action on the plenary floor, demanding to be able to speak for ourselves. We shouldn't have had to take this risk. We are making a critical call for support by UN agencies, member states, and most importantly, the EMRIP and the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In the final report of this year's UN Permanent Forum, the following recommendation was made. The Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to develop an international legally binding instrument on plastics pollution, including the marine environment, should guarantee the meaningful participation of Indigenous peoples in all negotiations. Their rights under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples should be respected, and their knowledge systems incorporated into the instrument. We graciously thank the Permanent Forum for their strong recommendation and are requesting the EMRIP take 2 urgent and critical actions as soon as possible to assist us in the upcoming session. First, affirm and reiterate the Permanent Forum recommendation in the final report of the EMRIP. And second, immediately contribute to a draft letter from the 3 Indigenous mandate holders on this topic to be used for advocacy with member states during the INC session. As it convenes in 3 weeks, we respectfully offer to submit a draft for your consideration. Finally, we also reiterate our call for support from member states in the room here today to adopt a robust and effective treaty that addresses the full lifestyle cycle of plastics from extraction of fossil fuels to waste and sets to protect Mother Earth for our current and future generations. Chimigwich, many thanks.
Thank you for your statement. I give the floor to Antime Sonde from Duran. Are you in the room?
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair, this afternoon I take the floor on behalf of all of the African caucus for Indigenous peoples, that is, which represents the diversity of peoples in the continent, the Batwa, the Tuareg, the Amazigh, the Odiek, the Maasai, and so many others whose voices are still not heard enough in this system, unfortunately. We welcome the fact that we're holding this interactive dialogue between UN bodies and us, and we restate that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, undrip, remains a fundamental instrument for the recognition, the protection of, and the development of our collective rights. This being said, for Indigenous peoples in Africa, this text remains broadly unenforced and unknown nationally. 3 major concerns deserve to be underscored here. The non-recognition politically and legally of this text. Mr. Special Rapporteur, we appeal to you. In most African countries, the Indigenous peoples are not recognized as such. We are either forcibly assimilated or deemed to be mere minorities, but we are not. Unequal participation in UN mechanisms, unfortunately, well, we are underrepresented internationally because of obstacles such as the obtention of visas, financial problems, and also because of the lack of knowledge of the participation principles our situation is pretty serious, and we want to draw your attention to it, Mr. Chairman. I'm referring here to serious human rights violations which are ongoing in Congo with Abattoir, in the south and north Kivu, in Burkina Faso, where the pearls are discriminated against and marginalized, in Mali, where the pearls and the Tuareg are also discriminated against and killed also. These are pretty serious situations which call for the UN treaties and EMRIP and the Permanent Forum address, because these are serious situations enduring in Africa. These situations really must be addressed urgently. These people there are disappearing. Mr. Chair, we are not only vulnerable people, we are also people who provide solutions. Now, we need to exist politically to be able to do that. We need to participate fully, and we need to be protected. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you. Now I invite Mexico.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. In acknowledging such distinguished panelists, we, through our commitments, ratify our commitment to the implementation of undrip to guarantee the exercise of the collective rights and exercise of free self-determination. I'd like to highlight the constitutional reform on the rights of indigenous peoples and Afro-Mexican peoples adopted unanimously by all political forces in the country in September 2024. This reform, translated into 74 different languages, recognizes the pluricultural makeup of Mexico in terms of its indigenous peoples as public rights holders with their legal personality and their own budget under Article 3 of the Declaration. This reform includes the obligation to adopt community development programs that promote agroecology, traditional crops, cornfields, native seeds, agro-food resources, and the optimal use of land free of dangerous substances. The government of Mexico is putting together a general law on consultation for indigenous peoples and African-Mexican peoples based on the declaration, which will be submitted to consultation. This proposal includes access to justice, normative systems, territories, sacred places, cultural heritage, intellectual and collective property, health and education, with an intercultural perspective, the right to consultation, and free, prior and informed consent. It also contains a section devoted to the promotion and strengthening of indigenous economies, as well as productive activities, as well as income generation, employment, supply and marketing, as just suggested by the Special Rapporteur this afternoon. Mexico is committed to the implementation of the undrip and expresses its interest to continue to drive it forward together with the indigenous government and experts and interested parties. We reiterate what we said during the 24th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Matters held in New York. We are delighted to share with this mechanism that thanks to the judicial reform, the Supreme Court of Justice of the nation will, for the first time after over 100 years, a minister president who is Mixteco indigenous. Finally, Mr. Chair, distinguished participants, we'd like to extend to you a warm invitation to a parallel event on this constitutional reform tomorrow, 17th of July at 11 a.m. in room 27. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you. I give the floor to Tini Nisca Rivera Castellon, Institute Race and Equality and Human Rights, following by Cordelia Kelly, Inuit Sargo Popular Council. Tini Nisca Rivera Castellon, you have the floor. Are you in the room?
Distinguished experts, representatives of the forum, and delegations present. I'm the daughter of the indigenous leader Brooklyn Rivera Bryan, distinguished representative of the Mosquito people of the Northern Caribbean coast historic defender, MP and leader of the Yatama Indigenous Party. The Nicaragua government stripped him of his legal personality as part of its oppression and determination to wipe out indigenous plurality. I would like to share with you this our deep concern about the enforced disappearance of my father on the 29th of September 2023. That day, at least 60 agents of the National Police Force erupted in his house without a warrant, with 3 patrols and an ambulance, which they used as a vehicle to be able to take him away. Since then, we have no information about his whereabouts, and our request for information have been met with direct threats. We've been told that if we continue to try and find him, all of our family will be arrested. This case of enforced disappearance occurred just a few weeks after his participation in the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Matters in 2023, that is, wherein he spoke out against the systematic violations of the rights of indigenous peoples in Nicaragua. In reprisals, the Sandinista Daniel Ortega government banned him from re-entering the country, told him to go through the Honduran border, in frustration of their sovereignty of our people. This is a pattern of transnational reprisal against anybody who exercises his or her right to free expression, and I have had to become exiled, and I am constantly under threat. I abandoned my community, my country, because I was afraid of becoming a victim of enforced disappearance or arbitrary detention. However, fear cannot prevent me from seeking international support and solidarity so that I can find the truth and secure the release of my father. My father is not an isolated case in Nicaragua. Repression against leaders, indigenous leaders, is systematic. Currently, at least 10 indigenous persons are imprisoned on political grounds. They are criminalized because they try to defend their territories and exercise the right to self-determination. In the face of the situation, I turn respectfully to this mechanism and everyone else here in the context of your mandates to ask for proof of life of my father, Mr. Brian, whose enforced disappearance represents a serious violation of human rights and of international humanitarian law. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your statement. I invite Cordelia Kelly from Inuit Circumpolar Council, following by next speaker, Kathleen Mua. So now I give the floor to Cordelia Kelly.
On behalf of Inuit Circumpolar Council, is my mic on? Yep. We thank EMRIP for the important report and recommendations and wish to raise one of the top issues in Alaska today. Since 2020, Alaska has experienced catastrophic salmon crashes in the Western Alaska, a central food source for many Inuit and other indigenous peoples. In 2021, subsistence salmon fishing on the Yukon River was prohibited for the first time, and every year since, instigating a complete unraveling of the life cycle of the indigenous residents along this river. And for a sense of scale, this is a river that is half the length of the Amazon. Last year, indigenous peoples on the Yukon became subject to a moratorium declared on subsistence salmon fishing, one that will last for 7 years. The youth who were to learn our way of life when the prohibitions began in 2020 will be adults when the moratorium is over, presenting an interruption to cultural continuity. And yet, Chinook and chum salmon can be caught if you are a commercial fishery. You can eat it if you buy it. In Alaska, local government is purchasing salmon and then donating it to indigenous peoples while it remains illegal to catch it yourself. Again, it can be bought and sold, but it cannot be caught by indigenous peoples on the Yukon who rely on it for their ways of life. This is one of the latest challenges to sovereignty that Inuit have a tradition of rising to meet. Inuit and Alaska's indigenous peoples are the rivers and oceans' most sustainable stewards, and yet Inuit are the first to be restricted. Inuit and neighboring indigenous peoples are bearing the weight of the decline, while large-scale commercial fisheries, a major contributor to this collapse through bycatch and climate impacts, remain business as usual. We have our sovereign rights to our traditional foods, as expressed in UNDRIP. And then you have what is happening in Alaska. The scale of the injustice is the very great space in between. Mr. Chair, what happens in our oceans impacts Inuit directly. Inuit-led stewardship must be the foundation of decision-making. It is with great pride, therefore, that we share a positive development that just happened last week. Following years of hard work, Inuit Circumpolar Council achieved permanent consultative status at the International Maritime Organization, the very first Indigenous peoples organization to be granted this status at the IMO. This marks a concrete example of the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples within a UN specialized agency shaping global shipping policies. Thank you for the opportunity to raise this issue.
Thank you for your statement. Now I invite for the statement Kathleen Moa, the Streets Movement Indigenous Organization Pacific, following by Russian Federation. So Kathleen Moa.
Thank you, Chair, members, and all Indigenous peoples gathered here today. Siota alofa. I am here to share love. My name is Kathleen Moore. I am Samoan, born in diaspora on the lands of Tangata Whenua, Aotearoa, New Zealand. I am here for our Pacific children who carry the silence and weight of unhealed intergenerational trauma. In line with Agenda Item 5 and referencing Articles 22 and 24 of UNDRIP, I affirm that Indigenous children deserve special attention, especially when navigating our traditional economic systems such as va and tautua, where the sacred relational space between people, community, and land, and the sacred act of service to family, village, and faith. Today, these systems have been reshaped through fear and struggle caused by colonization and migration. My goal is to foster a space for healing. Our children move between cultures, often code switching, embracing their Pacific heritage at home while adjusting to Western expectations. This creates challenges that children struggle to manage, especially when it is left unspoken. They seek attention through silence, addiction, or disruptive behavior, sacrificing their dreams and goals. But our children need to connect to the land that they live on so that they can build the bridge back to their traditional knowledge. This allows them to continue their practices while respectfully applying it to the land that they call home. But first, we must heal from the inherited expectations and pain. When we heal as people, we can make changes that benefit us all. When we don't, we pass that anger down to our children, which then reinforces the cycle to repeat itself. I ask EMRIP to recognize how intergenerational trauma in diaspora changes our traditional economic systems and places silent burdens on our children. I urge support for healing-focused recommendation that protect tautua and va and center Indigenous children's well-being. We need to recognize that pain exists on both sides. Intergenerational trauma is a global issue that requires a collective approach. Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 29, reminds us of the obligation to nurture a child's dignity and cultural identity through education. Healing starts in the space where we gather, such as schools, policies, and communities. It begins with truth-telling about our shared history and the realities faced by our children today so that they know that they belong. To all our children struggling with intergenerational trauma, we see you. You are enough, and you deserve to heal. Malo, and thank you.
I understand. I cannot stop this applause one. So anyway, thank you for the statement. I give the floor now to Alexei Novogilov from Russian Federation, following by Global Naga Forum. Russian Federation, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. Colleagues, I represent the academic community of the Russian Federation studying the lot of indigenous peoples, their ethno-cultural problems and sustainable development, and conduct expert analyses for industrial projects which require informed consent. I'd like to note that on the whole, the expert report reflects realities. However, we must underscore that with respect to Russia, the information is limited. In the report, for example, it's noted there's a deficiency of the mechanisms for selection by priority of fishing, including the volumes and types of catches. But I have to note that indigenous peoples in Russia, free, are allocated for a period of 49 years with a right to renew the fishing resources of their ancestors. The law on communities does not restrict the catch by species or size, and so we preserve the fishing rights for indigenous peoples. In the law on indigenous peoples, where reindeer husbandry is their main economic activities, it must be noted the cooperation that is being executed between economic agents and indigenous peoples. As a part of such cooperation, there are programs to support reindeer husbandry, but also healthcare, education, families, and fishing communities. Would also like to underscore the development of bylaws, for example, a decree by the Labour Ministry of this year, which establishes livestock breeder as a professional standard and expands it also to include a worker of nomadic residences, which guarantees a labor pension for indigenous women who are nomadic. We're also developing a forestry certification for to prevent companies from entering into this area of protection of forests. We also are engaged in interagency programs. For example, on the 8th of May, the government adopted a concept for developing the small indigenous peoples of the far north, Siberia, and the far east, where we discuss issues such as protecting their natural environment, traditional knowledge, and ensuring comfortable living conditions and access to education. At all stages of developing this concept, representatives of indigenous peoples participated in this work. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to Global Naga Forum, following by Ontario Native Women's Association. Global Naga Forum, you have the floor.
Chair, experts, and delegates. Only 2 months ago, the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization addressed a permanent forum on Indigenous issues on behalf of the Naga people, raising concerns about the silencing of human rights defenders in India and the protracted conflict between the Indigenous Naga community and the Government of India. Today, we speak once again on behalf of the Global Naga Forum, as Naga human rights defenders continue to face travel restrictions that have prevented them from attending this session. Their absence reflects the systemic barriers they face not only in participating in international forums such as this, but also in exercising their fundamental rights at home, including the right to maintain and develop their traditional economies. The Nagas, living across India and Myanmar, possess a unique history and identity, deeply tied to their ancestral lands and traditional governance systems. This was recognized by the Government of India in 2002 and by the 2015 Framework Agreement. Despite this, the Indo-Naga peace process remains stalled. The Framework Agreement remains unimplemented, and the Naga people continue to live under the shadow of the Armed Special Powers Act, which fosters impunity and has led to grave human rights violations, as tragically illustrated by the Oteng massacre in 2021. This protracted conflict also has direct consequences for the Naga people's traditional economies. Traditional economies are not merely systems of livelihood. They are rooted in ancestral land, kinship networks, cultural heritage, and self-governance. Yet these very foundations are under assault for the Naga people across Myanmar-occupied regions and all 4 Indian-occupied states they inhabit: Nagaland, Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, and Manipur. The construction of the border fence between India and Myanmar has dismantled the freedom of movement regime, severing kinship ties, disrupting trade, limiting access to farmland, undermining social-cultural cohesion, and weakening intergenerational transmission of knowledge. Further compounding the problem is India's refusal to legally recognize indigenous peoples, undermining the application of international legal protections and blocking progress toward restoring traditional economies, governance systems, and cultural identity. We respectfully urge the expert mechanism and UN member states to call on the government of India to implement the 2015 Framework Agreement, to repeal the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, to reinstate the freedom of movement regime across the Indo-Myanmar border, and initiate meaningful community-based dialogue with Naga representatives and local communities to explore rights-based and cooperative alternatives to border fencing, and to ensure border management is conducted in consultation with those affected. And lastly, to formally recognize the distinct legal status of indigenous peoples in India. The Naga people remain willing to engage in dialogue and to work constructively with the government of India to achieve a peaceful and just resolution that honors their dignity and heritage. We urge this forum to support their aspirations for peace, justice, and self-determination. Thank you, Chair.
Now I give the floor to Ontario Native Women's Association, following by Eriko Hopkinson, ACC, ACSIL's Asia. So Ontario Native Women's Association.
Hi, Dai. Kusuyo Chu Uganabira. I'm from Okinawa, Ryukyu. In the Ryukyu Islands, implementation of the undrip has limited due in large part to us still being unrecognized by the Japanese government. Even where there has been some movement on indigenous recognition by Japanese courts, this has not resulted in further implementation of the undrip. Lack of recognition of collective indigenous rights in Japan would make it legally impossible to pass meaningful legislation. In fact, in 2023, the Osaka High Court for the first time recognized that the Ryukyu Kingdom was invaded by Japan, that we were forcibly annexed in 1879, and what we were the indigenous people of the Ryukyu Islands. But in the same ruling, defied the rights outlined in Article 12 of the undrip. In other words, while the court acknowledged for the first time that we are indigenous, it also stated that Kyoto University was not required to return our ancestral remains that are being held and likely tested on. The other challenge to implementation of the undrip and the Ryukyus, especially our desire for the government of Japan to uphold Article 30, that military activity should not take place, is the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security between Japan and the US. 3 referendums in Okinawa have overwhelmingly voted against the construction of a new base in Henoko. Although the construction continues, children and youth in particular are caught in the literal crossfire of the military relationship. We have had a US helicopter crash into building at Okinawa International University. Military aircraft parts have fallen onto elementary school playground, and PFOS contaminates the water throughout the Ryukyu Islands. This includes PFOS from both Japanese Jieitai self-defense force bases and the 32 US bases. More recently, several Ryukyuan teenage girls and young women have been raped and murdered by servicemen. And as of 2022, the prosecution rate for these types of crimes was 1/3 Japan's national average. While we recognize that these are challenges.
Can you please sum up your statement?
Yes, like beyond the UNPFLI, sorry, we have a few concrete recommendations. Japan should immediately implement recommendations of multiple periodic reports from the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination to recognize Ryukyuans as indigenous people of Japan. So additionally, creation of this national action plan must be conducted in Ryukyu, Okinawa, and Hokkaido, not solely in Tokyo. Finally, we ask that member states increase their contribution to the UN Voluntary Fund for indigenous people. But importantly, ask the UN Voluntary Fund to consider pair funding for indigenous youth from non-UN language-speaking countries. For example, as speakers of Japanese, this would mean funding in tandem, one Ryukyuan or Ainu youth. And bilingual Ryukyuan or Ainu others interpret. Amazing work is being done by indigenous people on the ground, but that work is not always.
Can you please sum up your statement?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for understanding. Ontario Native Women's Association, following by Denmark. You have the floor, please.
Association is here amplifying the collective voices of over 35 Indigenous women's agencies. We thank EMRIP, the Special Rapporteur, the Permanent Forum, and the Voluntary Fund for their continued efforts to enhance Indigenous peoples' participation in the UN and advance the implementation of the UN Declaration. Globally, we are facing increasing anti-rights and anti-Indigenous rhetoric and action. Indigenous peoples' voices, solutions, and leadership are needed now more than ever. Your work and your mandates must be maintained. You are integral to the continued participation, leadership, and safety of Indigenous women. As such, we call on all member states to take seriously their commitment and obligations to human rights by fully paying their contributions to the UN system. The liquidity crisis must not be used as an excuse to reduce or combine the mandates of EMRIP, the Special Rapporteur, the Permanent Forum, or the Voluntary Fund. In addition, we wish to highlight two recommendations to states and the broader UN system. First, ensure Indigenous women's leadership, and second, ensure Indigenous women's safety. I will explain each now in more detail. First, states and the UN must ensure Indigenous women's leadership by engaging directly with Indigenous women in our organizations and ensure our participation in decisions on all items that impact our lives. It is our right to participate in decision-making through representatives of our choosing in decisions that impact our lives, our families, and our communities. This is affirmed under UNDRIP Article 18. Indigenous women have traditional and inherent rights and roles as leaders, matriarchs, water carriers, and caretakers of our lands. We hold an inherent and shared responsibility to protect, support, and care for Mother Earth in all our relations. It is critical that Indigenous women and our representative organizations and institutes are included. Second, states must ensure Indigenous women's right to safety. There is a direct connection between the violence against Mother Earth and violence against us as Indigenous women. As many states turn attention toward international relations and protecting the economy, it is critical that all levels of government and the United Nations not lose sight of their human rights obligations and responsibility to uphold the safety of Indigenous women. The safety and healing and well-being of Indigenous women must remain a priority as we navigate these times of economic uncertainty. States and corporate entities must be held accountable. Miigwech, Matna, Merci, Nyawen.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to Denmark, following by Indigenous Women League Nepal. So Denmark, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of Denmark together with Greenland. Our compass is set for the universal implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Together with other international human rights instruments, it provides a universal framework of minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the indigenous peoples of the world. We commend this year's study of the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples and would like to express our support to the point made that traditional economies are integral to the exercise of indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination. Allow me to take this opportunity to draw attention to a matter of importance for us: conflation of the indigenous peoples with other groups. We are concerned that when these terms are grouped together, it risks conflating them, and it risks a perception that these terms are synonymous, which they are not. Indigenous peoples have affirmed their identity as indigenous peoples, which states have subsequently recognized in international law and incorporated into international instruments. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples embodies a fundamental international instrument that outlines the inherent collective rights of indigenous peoples and affirms their identity as peoples equal to all other peoples. Unduly linking of indigenous peoples with local communities and or other terms contains the risk, intentionally or not, of blurring the concept of indigenous peoples and undermining the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So, esteemed experts, what do you see as the biggest challenges to remedy the conflation of indigenous peoples with local communities? Thank you, Chair.
I thank you for your statement. Now I give the floor to Indigenous Women League Nepal, following by Crimean Tatar Youth Center. Indigenous Women League Nepal, you have the floor.
And expert members, I read this statement on behalf of the Indigenous Women League Nepal. We appreciate EMRIP for including this agenda in this session. Indigenous peoples have a legal framework, namely the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and ILO Convention number 169, which has been adopted and ratified by my country, Nepal. The declaration grants indigenous people the right to make decisions based on their inherent laws, customs, and traditions through their own institutions. Furthermore, Articles 20, 23, 25, and 26 grant the economic, social, and cultural rights of indigenous peoples, focusing particularly on their distinctive spiritual relationships with traditionally owned land, territories, and other natural resources. Indigenous peoples' knowledge, skills, and practices are unique in regard to economic development in a sustainable manner. The economic activities of indigenous people are not only friendly to human beings but also to animals on land and water. It maintains the balance of biodiversity and is a tool for climate change mitigation. It requires specific skills, patience, and soulful determination, along with financial resources for indigenous people to develop this traditional way of economic development. However, there are no productive or promotional measures for traditional economies in my country. There is no administrative or financial support for those who want to continue their traditional businesses. The roots of our traditional economy have now been replaced by commercialization. In developing countries like Nepal, youth are often criticized for being eager to migrate abroad. However, this perception overlooks the deeper reality. It's not that indigenous youth are ready or eager to leave our homeland, but rather that we are in search of better opportunities, opportunities that ensure a dignified, secure, and fulfilling future. If there were adequate support for traditional economies, many of us would choose to stay, contribute locally, and continue the sustainable livelihoods passed down by our ancestors. In this regard, I request the expert mechanism to recommend to the Human Rights Council for better promotion of traditional economic practices, and we hope to build a future where we don't debate about indigenous rights, but instead we realize and recognize them. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to Ludmila Korotkeke, Crimean Tatar Youth Center, following by Friends of Lake Turkana. So, Crimean Tatar Youth Center, you have the floor.
Tatar people, one of the three indigenous peoples of Ukraine. We deeply value the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which reflects decades of advocacy and provides a vital framework for justice and self-determination. But in today's geopolitical reality, under occupation and war, its promises remain distant. For over a decade, my people have faced systematic persecution under Russian occupation in Crimea. Since 2014, 29 Crimean Tatars have been killed, 18 disappeared, and 248 persecuted on fabricated charges. 156 remain in prison. Our representative institution, the Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people, is banned. Our media are silenced, and our language is nearly erased from schools. This is a deliberate policy of identity erasure. Since 2022, repression has intensified. Crimean Tatars are forcibly conscripted into the Russian army to fight against their own country. Thousands were forced to flee to avoid this, while thousands others, like myself, live under daily threats of drones and missiles attacks. In this context, implementation of the declaration is not just about rights. It is about survival. We urge UN treaty bodies and special procedures to prioritize indigenous peoples in the situation of occupation and conflict. Concrete mechanisms are needed to monitor violations and ensure indigenous rights are upheld even during wartime. We thank the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples for his important studies this year on land identification and registration for the UN General Assembly and on the recognition of indigenous peoples for the Human Rights Council. We have submitted contributions to both and hope they will be taken into account. We also thank UN treaty bodies such as CCPR, CEDAW, and CERT for addressing indigenous issues, including in their reviews of states. We underline the need to expand financial support for indigenous participation in UN processes. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank countries who contribute to UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples, which plays a crucial role in enabling our voices to be heard. But this support must go to those who generally represent indigenous peoples, especially those under threat. These are growing concerns about actors linked to authoritarian regimes like Russia using these platforms to distort indigenous voices. The fund selection mechanisms must be reviewed and strengthened with more transparency and engagement with legitimate indigenous institutions. Let the declaration be not only a symbol of hope in peacetime, but a tool of protection even in times of war. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to Friends of Lake Turkana from Kenya, following by Indonesia. So Friends of Lake Turkana, Kenya.
From northern Kenya, and my statement is on behalf of Friends of Lake Turkana. The proposed Marsabit wind power project in northern Kenya risks perpetuating a troubling legacy, one in which indigenous pastoralists and fisherfolk communities are sidelined from decisions that profoundly affect their ancestral lands, cultural heritage, and future. Despite the decisions magnitude of this investment, the local pastoralists of Gas and El Molo, Samburu, Rendile, Turkana, and Gabra peoples have been largely excluded from meaningful engagements. This silence denies them their right to free, prior informed consent and fosters divisions that only serve the interest of external actors. Land is not a commodity for these communities. It's an expression of identity, belonging, and collective survival. Yet renewable energy projects continue to disregard indigenous land tenure systems, undermining their socio-cultural rights and fueling conflict. We call for a right-based approach to energy development that places indigenous people at the center of decision-making. We are facilitating a community-led movement that strengthens autonomy, promotes inclusive governance, and builds a collective voice through resource mapping, youth engagement, policy advocacy, and legal support. We aim to safeguard heritage, promote, eliminate climate resilience, and ensure equitable benefit sharing. We urge EMRIP and the international community to ensure corporate accountability through transparent ESIA and RAP processes, promote inclusive participation, especially of women, youth, and persons with disabilities, support communities in registering community lands and negotiating for community development agreements, recognize indigenous governance system as legitimate and essential for sustainable development, and to demand that climate action aligns with international legal instruments. Let us not repeat the injustices of the past. Let us build renewable future that are not only green, but just. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for your statement. Now I give the floor to Indonesia, following by National UHR's Forum. Indonesia, you have the floor.
Panelists, Indonesia takes note of the EMRIP report and recognizes that traditional economies are integral to the cultural identity, livelihoods, and sustainability of indigenous peoples and local communities. In the Indonesian context, masyarakat adat or adat communities have long played a critical role in preserving traditional knowledge and sustainable practices. Indonesia recognizes these communities within its constitution and protects their rights through a multi-layered legal framework. Currently, at least 9 national laws safeguard customary rights to land, forests, coasts, and other natural resources. Our delegation also wishes to share that on the ground, the Ministry of Agrarian Affairs has initiated pilot projects for documenting customary lands. In West Sumatra and Papua, land management rights certificates have been issued to protect Adat communities and ensure consent-based land use. Those land management rights certificates are essential administrative tools that establish clear demarcation of customary boundaries and prevent any utilization of ancestral land by external parties without the consent of Masyarakat Adat. Mr. Chair, I would also like to take this opportunity to respond to remarks made earlier by one participant, which appeared to advocate for or insinuate support for the disintegration of our sovereign nation. Allow me to reiterate that across Indonesia's archipelago, from Aceh to Papua, we continue to uphold the rights of our Adat communities within the framework of our national commitment to unity in diversity and inclusive development. The individual who spoke does not even reside in Indonesia and certainly does not represent the views or interests of the Papuan people, nor any legitimate or recognized entity within the Republic of Indonesia. Attempts to question the status of Papua and its provinces not only disregard international legal frameworks, but also dismiss the dignity and democratic voice of millions of Papuans who actively participated in Indonesia's civic and political life, including at the 2024 national election. In the province of Papua, for example, around 70% eligible voters have casted their votes at the election. I wish to reaffirm that since the enactment of the Special Autonomy Law in 2001, Papua's provinces have enjoyed an enhanced degree of autonomy and governance. This legal framework provides a strong basis for the promotion of Papuan welfare and rights, including affirmative action for Orang Asli Papua. Under this special autonomy, Indonesia continues to implement comprehensive development initiatives focused on education, healthcare, infrastructure, sustainable development, and cultural preservation with the active involvement of local communities. I thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to Claire Charters, National QE Chairs Forum, following by Pavel Diaskop. Can you please turn on the mic?
Aroha mai. Tēnā koutou katoa. I speak on behalf of Potikanga of the National Tribal Nations Chairs Forum of New Zealand and the Aotearoa Centre for Indigenous Peoples and the Law. I have 3 points. First, the current government has rejected any initiative to develop a national plan of action on the declaration, and coalition partners have rejected the declaration. Second, despite this, implementation of the declaration remains a priority for the National Tribal Nations Chairs Forum, specific tribal nations and Māori representative bodies. We pursue this in various ways, including by our participation in international fora such as this and before human rights treaty bodies. We are very grateful for your support. We also raise the declaration in courts at the highest level before the Waitangi Tribunal and in political contexts. Finally, we note again the Deputy Prime Minister's rejection of the Special Rapporteur's letter of engagement, requesting New Zealand's response to concerns he has heard from Māori. The Deputy Prime Minister misunderstood the nature of an allegation letter, which simply asks states to respond to the information they have heard. The Deputy Prime Minister described the Special Rapporteur's letter as offensive and an affront to New Zealand's sovereignty, illustrating his ignorance of and disrespect for the international human rights order. We respectively request the Special Rapporteur, Expert Mechanism, Permanent Forum, and human rights treaty bodies to maintain their oversight of New Zealand's ongoing breaches of the declaration. In particular, we invite the expert mechanism to repeat its request for country engagement with New Zealand. Kia ora koutou.
Thank you for your very precise statement. Appreciate it. Now I invite to Raipon Young Keralia for your joint statement, following by Chagosian Boys. Raipon Young Keralia, are you in the room? Yes.
The collective statement of organization and representative bodies of indigenous peoples of Russia. We support the joint letter by the three mechanisms concerning the right of indigenous peoples to participate in decision-making that affects them, a right that lies at the heart of the UN Charter, human rights, treaties, and the Declaration. We will never realize this right. However, if states continue to manipulate and control decisions about which indigenous representatives can attend United Nations meetings and missions, some states say they support the enhanced participation of indigenous peoples. But in practice, they do everything to stop even basic participation at meetings of indigenous peoples mechanisms. In particular, we speak about the member states that host UN headquarters, Switzerland and the United States, and the difficulty of indigenous representatives from my region, as well as Asia and Africa, in obtaining visas. With respect to EMRIP, the contradictory communications and extreme delays in the host country's visa process cost not only financial and opportunity costs, but also harms to the dignity of indigenous peoples. It is especially inappropriate when visas are denied or delayed to UN mandate holders. Let us remember that empty seat of the Iranian member of the Permanent Forum last session. We would like to remind the UN host countries that allowing indigenous peoples to relevant meetings is not a matter of goodwill, but rather an international obligation. We additionally draw attention to countries that have denied entry to experts on missions or retaliated against them afterwards. The mandates of the special reporter and EMRIP have both experienced these limitations to their work, including by countries who profess to be leaders in human rights. We would like to state clearly, it is not up to states to determine whether and who should be speaking in the UN on behalf of indigenous peoples. States must leave the barriers, restrictions, and discriminatory approaches. States must stop dividing indigenous peoples into first class who have privileges and can travel freely and second class who need to ask, back pay, and lose their voice. Therefore, we urge the three mechanisms to include in their report clear recommendations on how to enhance indigenous peoples' participation by eliminating visa barriers, and also to consider more neutral, friendly, and affordable places for indigenous peoples related UN meetings. Chair, we cannot ensure our right to participate in decision-making or enhance it until we secure equal and effective participation for all indigenous peoples in the existing bodies. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to Chagusian Boyes, following by Mario Agreda in Comendios, South America. Now, Chagusian Boyes, you have the floor. Are you in the room, Chagusian Boyes? Okay, if you're not in the room, okay, please.
Sí. Perdón, señor presidente. ¿Qué dice?
Sorry, I'm calling to the Chagusian Boyes. Are they in the room? If you're not in the room, then I'm moving to the next speaker. Mario Agreda in Comendios, South America. Yes, please.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, dear President, Secretariat. Dear brothers and sisters, Mario Agreda is my name, from the Goyan Nation. Traditional economy and resources for humanity. We, indigenous peoples, must take control of our own narrative, our policy, our politics, and our destiny. We must transform the our rights into a binding mandate for states, the right to veto decisions that run counter to our ways of living. There is a system designed to accumulate wealth and control us, and we offer a model based on reciprocity. This is what we do. The West misnames us, but we have created one of the most fertile soils in the world with high concentration of carbon, which recovers degraded land and eliminating pesticides. Our crops are stem from traditional knowledge, providing sustainability, which would save humanity and prevent the emission of greenhouse gases. Terra Preta India is its name. It was discovered that after 8,000 years, the land remains fertile today. But the West, with its money, is attacking us and our resources, cutting down trees, and none of this is sustainable. Do you not know that the trees are suffering? This is a deceitful system. According to Johan Esleman, the expert, if all the land was like our land, the climate crisis would be over in 5 years. This is not left-wing politics. This is saving the planet. What is at stake for states is maintaining control over us and our resources. When an Indian adopts and reproduces Western tradition, you might talk about plurinationality and self-determination, but that is just talk. You are merely submitting to Western oppression, which contradicts our culture. Many states say that they are our allies, but only through lip service, because their behavior is alien to us. The Maori nation of New Zealand teaches us. The chair interrupts.
Sum up your statement. Can you please sum up your statement?
Secretaria, ejecutan el jaca, una ceremonia antigua.
They organize a ceremony to demonstrate against a law. We must fight with the strength of tigers and free our land. We own the land. We have land titles. Why? Because we and the land form one person.
I respect, I expect and also request to every speaker to respect the time slot we are given. And if you actually go, as I repeat, with precise statement to the point, that also give sometimes, if reduce the times for others as well, it will be helpful. So this is my appeal to you all. When you speak, please be precise and to the point, consider for others as well, so that everyone can get the chance and opportunity to share their expectation to this forum. Now I give the floor to Aceh Sumatra Indigenous Peoples, following by the Philippines.
Right, just give me. Okay, Mr. Chair, thank you very much for giving us opportunity to speak, as we have been waiting since Monday from item 3. Mr. Chair, distinguished delegate, fellow indigenous people, my name is Tengku Fajri Krong, and I speak on behalf of the 6 million indigenous people of Aceh, Sumatra, and we are not masyarakat adat, as Indonesia stated earlier, but we are the indigenous people of our land. I come before you today to speak the truth, and many have tried to silence. The Indonesian government continue to violate the human right of Achenese people systematically, brutally, and without accountability. Just recently, Indonesia has deployed 6 additional battalions of military forces into Aceh for no reason, just to intimidate, suppress, and control our people. With this new wave of militarizations, communities live in fear. Indigenous villages are being watched, voices are silenced, and the daily life is overshadowed by the threat of violence. This is not new. For decades, Indonesia has committed crimes against people of Aceh. Mass killing, enforced disappearances, torture, rape, and displacements. Our land has been plundered. Our oil, gas, and forests taken without our consent and without benefit to our community. We are treated not as citizens, but as colony. The so-called autonomy promised in 2005 Helsinki Agreement was never honored by Indonesia. We are not allowed to raise our own flags. We are not free to teach our history. Our right as indigenous nation are denied at every level. We declare clearly and firmly the solution is not more dialogue with Jakarta. The solution is independent. The people of Aceh have the right to be free from Indonesia occupation, from militarizations, from exploitation. Article 3 and 4 of the UN Declaration on the Right of Indigenous People affirm our right to self-determination, and we are here to claim it. We call on this expert mechanism to condemn Indonesia ongoing human rights violation in Aceh, to demand the withdrawal of military forces, and to support our struggle for independence. Indonesia must be held accountable and Aceh must be free. Insya Allah, Getanyau akan merdeka dari penjajah Indonesia. I thank you.
I request all the speakers, when you made a statement, to make a respectful manner to each other. That's why we are here, to engage respectfully. I like to reiterate here that the UN promotes dialogue and exchange between different actors with a view to promoting sustainable peace, development, and human rights. All participants are encouraged to contribute to EMRIP in a spirit of constructive, multi-stakeholder dialogue, keeping a focus on the theme of the discussion. The meetings of the expert mechanisms, as any UN system events, are guided by the highest ethical and professional standards, and all participants are expected to become with integrity and respect towards all participants attending or involved with any meeting of EMRIP. We count on your cooperation to ensure that these standards are adhered to by all participants in this session. We ask all participants to exercise decorum, avoid abusive or disrespectful language or derogatory or inflammatory remarks. Now I give the floor to Philippines, following by Assemblée des Premières Nations de Quebec et du Labrador. Philippines, you have the floor.
Beneath the floor, the Philippines expresses its deep appreciation to the expert mechanism for its substantive work in advancing indigenous peoples' rights, which the Philippines strongly supports. In 1997, the Philippines enacted the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, affirming the rights of our indigenous peoples to ancestral domains, self-governance and empowerment, social justice, and cultural integrity. This landmark legislation became the model for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Since then, the Philippines has made significant strides in realizing the noble goals of UNDRIP through an inclusive and participatory approach involving various stakeholders. These include our independent National Human Rights Institution, whose participation we fully support and welcome. As highlighted in EMRIP's report on traditional economies, ownership of ancestral domains is a key driver of economic empowerment. We cannot but fully agree. The Philippines has to date issued 280 certificates of ancestral domain title, covering more than 6.4 million hectares and benefiting 1.5 million indigenous peoples' rights holders. We also support the enhanced participation of indigenous peoples in multilateral discussions under a separate category from civil society. This is to empower them and prevent the misuse of the IP space by other interest groups that advance ends other than human rights. National particularities should inform discussions on participation criteria. In the case of the Philippines, we have a National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, an independent agency composed of representatives from the country's 7 ethnographic areas. In April 2023, the NCIP headed the Philippine delegation to the constructive dialogue with the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination in April 2023. The Philippines is pleased to contribute to the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples, whose 40th anniversary we are commemorating this year. And you can count on our continued support moving forward. Before I end, Mr. Chair, if I may, I would like to raise a procedural matter to rectify a possible misimpression regarding the official representation of the government of the Republic of the Philippines in this meeting. I would like to note that the government of the Republic of the Philippines has not made any intervention in previous sessions of this meeting, and any articulation of official views will be delivered by the duly accredited representative of the Permanent Mission of the Philippines to the United Nations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Philippines, and for clarification. And I like to invite now Francis Barol Paul. Sorry, for the wrong pronunciation, if it is. Assemblées des Premières Nations de Quebec et du Labrador, following by Amina from Akal El Hazib. Francis, you have the floor.
Oui, Lucien Wabranik, chef Anishinaabe de l'Aquisition, au nom de la PNQL. Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chairman, we are here to speak out clearly against a reality experienced all too often by Indigenous peoples, despite the UNDRIP's option for Canada and provinces such as Quebec. Quebec systematically violates the principles of the UNDRIP. Proof of that is that the government of Quebec is about to impose 20 to 25% of the forest territory under PL 25 bill, which reserves part of that territory to private interests without our free, prior, and informed consent. This is not a bureaucratic mission. It is an attempt to methodically expropriate us. This bill in Articles 26 and 30 and 32, violates those articles and the constitutional obligations of Quebec. There has been no consultation, no true worthy of that name. It's a systematic violation of our rights in a long line of violations. Our rivers have been dried up, our forests have been razed to the ground, and my rights despised. This is enough. This is enough. We have a right to self-determination and self-governance for our territories. To ignore that reality is to perpetuate a colonialist logic that has no place in the modern state. The recognition of our rights and the implementation of the declaration is something we demand. The immediate suspension of the forest reform and the beginning of a peer-to-peer governmental dialogue is what we want on the basis of respect and international law. We therefore make the following 4 recommendations. Number 1, that the mechanism document and speak out against the cases of non-respect of the free, prior, and informed consent by federated states such as Quebec. Number 2, Canada establish accountability mechanisms under UNDRIP, and to treat all provinces equally. 3, that the report of the mechanisms that embody environmental covenants and account for violations, especially with regards to biodiversity and traditional knowledge. Number 4, that the UN strengthen governance so that indigenous peoples are recognized as co-participants on an equal basis. As long as federated states and with impunity circumvent the convention, the undrip will continue to be a dead letter. We need to send a clear message. Indigenous peoples are not an option, they're mandatory. They're an obligation with indigenous peoples will not remain silent in the new form of colonialism disguised in under public policy. Our rights are effective nationwide. They must be respected and recognized. As the chair interrupts.
Please wrap up your statement. Now I give the floor to Amina from Akal El Hazeh, following by Ukraine. Amina, are you in the room?
Here. Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chairman, honourable assistants. First of all, I would like to thank and commend the brothers and sisters and the co-facilitating countries who have worked and committed themselves to fully involve indigenous peoples in everything affecting them in a very and different arena without discrimination, restriction, or circumvention. Mr. Chairman, this is a statement made, a joint African statement, wherein we would like, first of all, to commend the EMRIP and the Special Rapporteur for all the efforts they have made, tireless efforts to promote and protect the rights of indigenous peoples worldwide. Their reports provide reliable information about the challenges which indigenous peoples face, and these reports propose practical solutions to meet these challenges and to find lasting solutions and fair solutions. Indigenous peoples in Africa are by far in the worst of situations worldwide because they accumulate all forms of right violations, and African governments do not recognize their free, prior, and informed consent principles and claim at worst that the indigenous peoples do not exist in Africa, and at best that all Africans are indigenous, and they do not recognize the rights of indigenous peoples. Ladies and gentlemen, experts and special rapporteur and distinguished audience, it would be right to underscore that our continent is the largest of all, and that we come from 5 sub-regions, and we accumulate all the problems that affect indigenous peoples worldwide. Given Resolution 5412 and in the light of the importance of the active and real participation of indigenous peoples in all the dialogue affecting them, it is necessary and urgent that the position of African states be unlocked and that they be brought to account. Nothing without us and nobody left behind. Those 2 principles we recommend the following. Number 1, that the Special Rapporteur underscore the complexity of our situation in Africa in his report by supporting our legitimate claims to self-determination pursuant to the provisions of undrip and the principles of free, prior, and informed consent. Number 2, that the EMRIP, pursuant to Resolution 3325, enjoined states in Africa to respect the declaration and to adopt a clear and sincere and responsible attitude towards indigenous peoples in Africa. And finally, that African states participate actively in the process to strengthen the participation of indigenous peoples to the Human Rights Council and to support it by being involved in its work in the future. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to Ukraine, following by Gunjal Ikermonda. So now Ukraine, now you have the floor.
Ukraine expresses its appreciation to the expert mechanism for its vital work in promoting the rights of indigenous peoples. We reaffirm our unwavering commitment to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and to the principles and values it upholds. Ukraine is home to three indigenous peoples, the Crimean Tatars, the Karayims, and the Krimchaks, whose rich cultural heritage and enduring historical presence form an integral part of our national identity. In line with international standards, we recognize their distinct status and remain fully committed to safeguarding their rights. In 2021, Ukraine adopted the law on indigenous peoples of Ukraine, which guarantees their collective rights to culture, language, education, self-governance, and representation. This law marked a significant step toward implementing United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples at the national level. Regrettably, since 2014, we have observed persistent and systemic violations of the rights of indigenous peoples in the context of the Russian Federation's unlawful occupation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. The prohibition of damaged lease of the Crimean Tatar people by the occupying power constitutes a clear infringement of the right to self-representation as enshrined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. These violations have escalated further following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, significantly heightening the risks faced by the indigenous peoples of Ukraine. According to the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, Crimean Tatars continue to face systemic violations of their rights, including politically motivated detentions, house raids, and criminal prosecution under fabricated charges of extremism and terrorism. Many are subjected to unfair trials and transferred to distant regions of the Russian Federation to serve unlawful sentences. Moreover, Russia's attempt to impose its political and legal system in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, including Crimea, follows the same repressive model seen in Crimea since 2015. The recent Putin's decree of March 2025 concerning the so-called legal status of Ukrainian citizens reveals Russia's ongoing policy of identity erasure, cultural oppression, and Russification. The prohibition of Ukrainian language education, forced conscription, and restrictions on cultural and religious expression constitute further violations of indigenous rights. These actions not only breach international law, but risk causing irreversible harm to future generations. Mr. Chair, the indigenous peoples of Ukraine, among others, continue to suffer deeply under these conditions. Thus, we urge the UN mechanism, including the Special Rapporteur, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and treaty bodies to give due attention to these violations and to ensure that the rights of indigenous peoples of Ukraine are upheld and protected. I thank you.
Thank you for your statement. Now I give the floor to Gonzalo Munda, following by the statement Brazil. So Gonzalo Munda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be speaking on behalf of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Caucus. At the outset, I would like to acknowledge and thank the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples for providing me and other grantees the necessary means for us to take part in this important gathering. The Asia Indigenous Peoples Caucus would like to thank and welcome EMRIP for your studies on the rights of indigenous peoples to data and on the rights of indigenous peoples to their traditional economies. Although the report on the traditional economies has been submitted, we would still like to highlight these critical areas that, though are implicit in the report, do require enhanced attention for achieving the goals of the recommendations. We call for the inclusion of traditional indigenous economies and value systems into the national education systems. Our youth must be taught not only about the mainstream economics, but also about our own knowledge systems. Indigenous knowledge holders must be recognized as educators and our languages and ecological philosophies included in curricula. We call upon EMRIP, UNPFII, UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UN Voluntary Fund, and other UN bodies to recognize these as priority areas and to recommend that states collaborate with indigenous peoples to decolonize education system and fund traditional economic education and indigenous culture competency building programs. Adopt mandatory safeguards to prevent forced evictions, physical or economic displacement, and encroachment on the territories of indigenous peoples. Support indigenous peoples in strengthening their traditional economies by revitalizing customary governance systems, enhancing collective resource management, and advancing food sovereignty, including legally recognizing and respecting indigenous peoples' sovereignty over their knowledge and data. Finally, legally recognize and promote indigenous peoples' traditional economies by adopting comprehensive legal and policy frameworks aligned with international standards, including UNDRIP, ILO Convention 169, and other core human rights treaties. Thank you.
Thank you for your statements. Now I give the floor to Brazil, following by the statement from the Indigenous Women and Biodiversity Network. So Brazil, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Brazil welcomes the opportunity to contribute to this coordination segment and reaffirms its commitment to working alongside the United Nations mechanisms in the promotion and protection of indigenous peoples' rights. At the national level, we are undergoing a significant transformation in the relationship between the Brazilian state and indigenous peoples. This transformation is anchored in the consolidation of indigenous participation within the top administrative and political structures of federal government. For the first time, decisions regarding the rights and needs of Brazil's more than 305 indigenous peoples are being shaped by indigenous leaders themselves, drawing from their own lived experiences, knowledge system, and historical struggles. This process marks a rupture with the tutelary approach that has shaped Brazilian indigenous policy for decades. Two emblematic examples are the creation of the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples, an unprecedented institution in Brazilian history led by Minister Sônia Guajajara, and the appointment of indigenous leaders to head the National Foundation for Indigenous Peoples, FUNAI, and the Special Secretariat for Indigenous Health, CESAI. Among the government's current priorities are the demarcation and protection of indigenous lands, the removal of illegal invaders, and the implementation of territorial management plans in close coordinations with indigenous communities. Since the beginning of 2023, Brazil has demarcated more indigenous lands than in the previous 10 years, signaling a renewed and tangible commitment to territorial rights. In parallel, the government has responded to the emergency situation in the Yanomami territory, restored the budgetary capacity of FUNAI, and acted to repeal normative acts that had enabled human rights violations, such as those facilitating artisanal mining in protected areas. We acknowledge that challenges remain, but we believe that the present moment reflects a turning point, a reconfiguration of indigenous policy into a lasting state policy. This approach is grounded in the recognition of indigenous peoples as agents of public policy, combining traditional knowledge with state management and institutionalizing intercultural dialogue within government structures. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Lucy Molenke, Indigenous Women and Biodiversity Network, following by the statement from Red International de Derechos Humanos Europa. So, Lucy Molenke, you have the floor.
I'm here, but yeah, thank you, Chairperson, and thank you, everyone, and thank you, panelists. That was a very good discussion, and also want to align myself with other statements made by the African group. My name is Lucy Mulenke. I'm speaking on behalf of Indigenous Women and Biodiversity Network and the African Indigenous Women Organization and Indigenous Information Network. A lot has been said, Mr. Chairman, and I want to really take up what you've said. We make it as short as possible. And our issues and problems that have been already expressed from morning and from the other days is a struggle of indigenous peoples and are similar from one place to the other. And we really thank the United Nations that we have these mechanisms where we can be able to talk and discuss and share the different issues that we have. However, we really would like to really urge that the mechanisms be more diverse to allow more indigenous people to participate. We advocate for having funding go direct to indigenous peoples, women and youth. And indeed, for it to go directly, we need also capacity to be enhanced, and we need them to be supported. And ours today is to urge the mechanisms to work closely together and to see how they can increase funding and enhance participation, especially on development issues that impact on indigenous peoples, women, and youth. Because these issues are many, and if we don't work, learn, and link together, then we cannot move forward, because we'll all the time be having issues as had already been expressed. And the main issue is the issue of funding. So, Mr. Chairman, I'll just stop there to make it a super short so that the rest can also have the opportunity. I thank you.
Thank you so much. I deeply appreciate it. Next speaker is Unai Nailia Barnard Canales from Red International de Derechos Humanos Europa, following by Tony Chiran from Bangladesh Indigenous Youth Forum. So, Unyam, you have the floor.
Microphone.
Arukitaiki Nikiasitaiki. Un saludo del
From the Chiquitano people of Bolivia, greetings. I represent the Chiquitos Truo nation. The territories in San Jose are going through a very serious environmental crisis whose hallmark is massive deforestation. Over the last 10 years, we've lost over 10 million hectares of forests in the Santa Cruz, more than 4 million, because chiefly of the expansion of agriculture and single crops farming, in addition to the fact that the government is developing crops that should not be developed there. This has affected ecosystems and biodiversity and the water supplies, which are essential for the survival of indigenous communities there. The right to a healthy environment, especially in indigenous areas, is a crucial principle in international law and national law. But in the Chiquitana area, deforestation and forest fires have caused the loss of productive land in violation of this right and other rights acknowledged, recognized by international laws and also Law 300, ILO Convention 169, and as well as the Esquessu Treaty and the undrip. Additionally, the loss of underground water and has affected our water security and our communities who depend on this for agriculture, animal husbandry, and food. We would like to invite the Special Rapporteur and the mechanism to come to our lands to see things firsthand. There you'll be able to provide advice and remind our country of its international commitments and national commitments. We need a positioning on those who are responsible for forest fires and the expansion of agricultural land for exports, which violates our food sovereignty and produces many social and environmental impacts that are negative and stifling our peoples. We also ask that the participation of indigenous peoples be strengthened in this arena, and for all of the work that has had an incident on what we did before, and all the voices that are still not being heard. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your statements. Now I give the floor to Tony Chiran from Bangladesh Indigenous Youth Forum, following by next statement from Horo panel Gaia Amazonas. Tony Chiran, you have the floor. Mic, please. Your mic.
On behalf of Bangladesh Indigenous Youth Forum, we welcome this interactive dialogue and reaffirm the importance of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in EMRIP as a vital framework for the recognition, protection, and promotion of the rights of indigenous peoples globally, including in Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, indigenous peoples continue to face challenges in realizing their rights to land, self-determination, cultural identity, and meaningful participation in decision-making processes that affects their lives. Despite the commitments under UNRIP and Bangladesh obligations under international human rights treaties, indigenous communities in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, CST, and the Plainland districts frequently experience land dispossession and lack of adequate consultations and barrier to justice. And address the land disputes in transparent and participatory manner and ensure that indigenous peoples' rights are respected following UNRIP and recommendations from the UNPFII, the special report and relevant treaty bodies. We further call on the UN Voluntary Fund on Indigenous Peoples to continue supporting Indigenous Peoples representatives from Bangladesh to meaningfully participate in the UN mechanism and share their life experiences and aspirations. We urge the UN EMRIP, UNPFII, Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and UN Voluntary Fund and UN bodies to urge the government of Bangladesh to recognize indigenous peoples and their rights to self-determination, free, prior, and informed consent in Bangladesh, and which is enshrined in UNRIP. To urge the government of Bangladesh to enact the Bangladesh Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, BIPRA, and to urge the government of Bangladesh to form separate dedicated ministry for Plainland Indigenous Peoples and separate land commission for Plainland Indigenous Peoples in Bangladesh, and to urge the government of Bangladesh to fully implement the CST Accord of 1997 and finally, we urge all stakeholders to strengthen accountability and ensure that indigenous voices are heard and respected in national policies and development plans, and to organize a meaningful dialogue between indigenous peoples and the government on indigenous peoples' rights. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for your statement. Now I give the floor to Jene pour les droits de sorry, my pronunciation is very bad. It's in French written. So I read the Foro Panel Gaia Amazonas, Mr. Olnar Ortiz. You have the floor.
Genève pour les droits de l'homme.
Nawini, Guajaveno. Soy Olnar Ortiz, abogado indígena del pueblo Guarani.
I come from the Amazon of Venezuela. I appear to raise the concern about the increasing reprisals we indigenous leaders face. The reports of the High Commissioner's Office reveal a serious trend whenever an indigenous leader turns to EMRIP or the forum to bear witness. The risk that he be subject of reprisals increases. This undermines the credibility of the UN system and calls for urgent action. Serious events demonstrate this in 2022. Alexa Cunningham was stripped of her nationality because she was involved in EMRIP in 2019. The NASA Cristina Autista was killed in Tocuyo. These cases highlight the gap between the international commitments that exist and effective protection on the ground. When defenders go home, many do not have protection or institutional support. The existing mechanisms are limited and fragmented. There is a critical void which leaves them vulnerable. Any indigenous testimony is rooted in Mother Earth. To protect this testimony is to safeguard the credibility of this forum, which is why we recommend, number one, that you create a SR and develop a protocol with clear early warning routes, technical support, and diplomatic action, which is triggered as soon as a risk is identified. Number two, to establish an emergency fund on the basis of voluntary contributions from states, which provides safe protection and expeditious transport for threatened defenders. Number three, to invite states to increase their contribution to the voluntary fund and the new emergency fund, and to submit annual reports on concrete measures to provide protection Also, we urge states to publicly recognize the legitimate work of human rights defenders, of indigenous human rights, and to expeditiously investigate any attack and to punish perpetrators. Accountability is crucial to prevent more violence. Mr. Chairman, like Cristina Autista, if we remain silent, we are killed. If we speak, they also kill us, which is why we are speaking. Let us act together so that indigenous speakers can return home alive, in dignity, and with a future. Thank you.
Thank you for your statement. Before I turn to the turn back to our distinguished panelists, I would like to give the last one, and I will request also to be very brief and precise. It's very interesting. It's Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, Manuel M. Castillo. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am Maya from Mexico. Today I speak in my capacity as a staff member of the Outreach and Engagement Planning Office of the National Museum of the American Indian, the NMI, and the Smithsonian Institution. I wish to express my gratitude to EMRIP for organizing this panel in a timely manner. I would also like to express my gratitude to the indigenous delegates from around the globe who dedicated years of effort to drafting the declaration. Your Excellencies, in terms of the declaration, the NMI is pleased to share that through concrete initiatives, it is committed to strengthening its approaches to consultation, collaboration, and partnership with indigenous peoples through the Western Hemisphere. In support of its mission, the museum builds, sustains, and expands relationships that elevate native voices and promote the exchange of knowledge and resources among indigenous communities. These efforts align with Articles 13 and 14 of the Declaration on the Rights of Self-Determination, Knowledge Transmission, and Control of Educational Resources. The NMI efforts to return indigenous belongings and ancestral remains aligns with Article 12 of the Declaration. Since its establishment in 1989 through the NMI Act, the museum has recognized the significance of self-determination and cultural sovereignty for indigenous peoples. The museum affirms that repatriation is not only a legal obligation, but also a fundamental human right for indigenous peoples. Since 1991, the NMI has successfully completed 125 repatriations and conducted over 300 consultations. In 2022, the Smithsonian Institution adopted a policy to promote co-stewardship and ethical returns to indigenous peoples. In alignment with this policy, the NMI developed a four-pathway framework for return: community loan, shared stewardship, repatriation, and ethical return. This framework supports the recovery of ownership, authority, and decision-making power by indigenous peoples over their cultural belongings. Your Excellencies, the NMI acknowledges the importance of EMRIP's thematic studies on the cultural heritage of indigenous peoples and on repatriation. Finally, the museum concurs with the coordinated efforts by the expert mechanism, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the UN Voluntary Fund, and members of the UN treaty bodies, recognizing them as essential to achieving the aims of the declaration. Hajni Pola, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you for your statement.
Also, of course, do a lot of important work in relation to colleagues, because the UN treaty body system is, to be honest, not always very easily accessible and understandable in terms of when to exactly submit what and where. So any kind of information sharing and experience sharing is very important. Sometimes, indeed, our procedures seem very long. Sometimes they seem very ineffective. We have indeed no urgent actions, as the special rapporteur and others can indeed do. And also the budget crisis affects all of us. One of our sessions and the sessions of other treaty bodies have been cancelled for the fall. We simply cannot meet, and that means we cannot do our work. Now, this, however, should not make us sad only and frustrated, but I hope also that, at least for me, meetings like this give me another sense of energy and urgency in order to continue the work for Indigenous peoples' rights. My last remark would be one of the issues that I hear pretty much across the board is indeed topics such as climate change and environmental degradation. We also increasingly deal with that no longer only as an issue of private life or home, but as an issue of the right to life, because that's basically what it, for many Indigenous peoples, comes down to. I will leave it here. I thank you very, very much for all your information, your appeals and your stories. I will take them back to the Palais Wilson, where we finalize our meeting. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Madam Chair of the Permanent Forum.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank all the participants who shared their interventions. I think I was extremely, and I heard it over and over, that despite fear, despite the concern, people still take the courage and come to forums such as this to express the need of their communities, of their peoples. And I know that each of you, when you come here, you're representing the voices and the needs of people who are not here with us. So I want to first of all thank you for your courage for being here. I heard over and over how the liquidity crisis should not be used to diminish the spaces in which we advocate for and uphold Indigenous people's rights. I also heard appreciation to the states, the member states that have contributed and continue to contribute, not only so that the UN systems can function, but also to the UN Voluntary Fund, so that more Indigenous peoples can participate. And I think this speaks to the challenges that have been highlighted in terms of barriers for enhanced participation of Indigenous peoples, whether it be the obtaining of visas or the financial costs. And so I would urge again and reemphasize the call that was made to make contributions to the UN Voluntary Fund so that more than 3% can be supported and participate in these very important forums. And I think it's extremely important that Indigenous peoples are provided the supports to build capacity, because when you're an Indigenous person like me, growing up in a small community of more than 1,000 people, coming to venues such as this can be quite intimidating. And it's really important that we have the supports so that we can become positive contributors in these really rich discussions about things that are important to us and as we advocate for Indigenous people's rights. And finally, I think the person has left, but you had me at, I am here to share love. So I know we're here to talk about ways in which we can collaborate. I really like the suggestion that Indigenous children deserve special attention, and I wanted to leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the UN Voluntary Fund. Yes.
Thank you, brothers and sisters, and other delegations who have listened to us. Your time, we don't take it for granted. As UN Voluntary Fund, it could not be possible to see those voices of my brothers and sisters from indigenous communities, some of them who is their first time to be in this space that it is close to few people, not everybody. And as a fund, if it is not there, I don't think somebody like me could have had an opportunity to be a fellow when I was a very young girl, a grantee, and now sitting here as a board of trustee. That once it gives you hope that the voluntary fund is not just building the skills, but also building hope of millions of indigenous people to give them space to interrogate the system of the UN and bring their lived realities to these spaces. But having said that, and as much as we said that the fund still have a lot of gaps, and we are calling upon partners, governments, and even indigenous people to be our ambassador out there and to continue sharing messages of hope and messages of encouragement that people can support the fund, but so that more indigenous people can not just only participate in EMRIP, but even in permanent forum, which mostly it's difficult to get visas, but also to other treaty bodies like the third Human Rights Council, because it's only when you're in the table, it is when you are able to articulate your issues. But when you're absent, your issues are not going to be articulated. So I live by saying, let's become the ambassadors of the fund. Let's see it positively, and also our partners and government who have already committed to support the fund. Please, we want you to be our ambassadors, especially to my African governments also to participate in committing for the fund. Thank you and God bless you.
Thank you. Now may I request the special rapporteur for your closing remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As sharing the last, speaking the last, it has been a humbling experience to be a special rapporteur for 6 months, because it gives you that opportunity to listen to real human story of suffering, of very particular marginalization, of something that it's of the old age of suppression. I just want to make 2 concluding points, and one I have actually, the first one I've already said it, is having listened and read from indigenous people over the last 6 months, I had an initial conclusion that indigenous peoples are really living in the last square meters of the land, because they kept pushing back for centuries, and now there is no more space to push back to. So many are reacting to any new attempt to be dispossessed. So it does has a direct link with a growing trend of tensions and criminalization of indigenous peoples. Because coincidentally, there is also a growing demand for indigenous people's land. The new transition minerals, the need to protect 30% of the territory, are actually pushing outsider to want more indigenous people's land. This is a time, I think, when it's critically important. That's my second point. My second point is one of the reasons I decided to write my first report on recognitions. On recognition, because state cannot protect or deliver on right that they don't actually recognize. And across Asia as a continent, across Africa, many states are in a state of denial that indigenous people's rights do not depend on domestic legislation. They exist regardless of whether or not indigenous people are recognized. I thought it was necessary to try and ease the understanding for those states which are really grappling, some willing to do something, but having difficulties in understanding what actually indigenous people's rights are all about. So I really take this opportunity to thank those of you who have contributed to my two studies on recognition first and on demarcation. They have been very, very helpful. And I look forward to interacting more with all of you and engaging more with indigenous peoples, states, private sector, and other stakeholders. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Rapporteur. My time shows we have 8 minutes remaining, and I also have my expert colleagues. If you are interested to take the floor, I'm happy to engage with this. Otherwise, I actually like to hear a statement from indigenous delegates who are in the room. 8 minutes we have in hand. So, okay. Let me check the list. May I give the floor to now to Archmore Organization, Muhammad Amadou Aji Muhammad. Are you in the room? Okay, if you are not in the room, I'm moving to another one. Ximena Contra Romero from Cona de Pua, South America.
Señor Presidente.
President.
Sorry. Señor Presidente, señor Relator.
So, Chairperson, Rapporteur, experts, members of the panel, brothers and sisters, I hail you all. I belong to the Mifika people.
Son las semillas que guían nuestra palabra.
It is important to learn, to respect, and love. We are here to share with you on the basis of the 1,000-year-old Nawak tradition. On behalf of our ancestors, I speak from my people's roots with a choice that does not fully belong to myself. It echoes the volcanoes and grandmothers of our people. We have a deep vision that goes back to our very hearts. We want to see no divisions between peoples, languages, lands. We are all one family across the planet. Indigenous peoples work and earn on the basis of reciprocity and not the attempt to earn as much as possible and accumulate wealth. We wish to nourish all communities in harmony with the world. This kind of economy shows that abundance, harmony, do not require any form of exploitation. And yet today we have to pay to breathe clean air, to drink unpolluted water. Everything around us has been turned into goods. For generations, we are no longer living in harmony, but under a burden of all our property being broken up into fractions. This is not our vision of the future. We need fertile land, not patents. We need our ancestral lands, and through them regain our right to health. Balanced economies are vital for resilience against climate change. We are the guardians of forests and seas. We are guarantors of another different way of living. We want to go back to our roots. Everything is interconnected. The land gives us the opportunity to start from scratch, but to do this, we need to deal, first of all, with fear, the fear of deprivation. In our very cells, we have the memory of balance, and if we listen with our hearts, we will be able to rebuild, heal, and move forward in harmony and coherence with the world, regain our economic coherency and honesty, and that is the future of the world.
Let me try. Please be finished. Try to finish 2 minutes. Naomi Jovitane from Suriname, stitching Akure, Suriname, South America. Are you in the room? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The NGO Manitoba Kiwait Nui Okimakanak in northern Manitoba, Canada, generally concurs in the recommendations set out in paragraphs 95, 96, and 115 of the EMRIP report on the rights of Indigenous peoples to their traditional economies. Paragraph 7 of the draft reports note that Canada and other states have adopted constitutional and legislative frameworks that recognize traditional economies. We recommend that the first sentence of recommendation at paragraph 96 be amended to read, states should adopt and strengthen constitutional and legal frameworks and implement concrete measures to monitor and enforce existing constitutional legal frameworks that explicitly recognize and protect Indigenous peoples' rights to their lands, territories, and resources, as well as their governance systems. We've reviewed the submission of Canada in response to the call for input, and we note that Canada fails to comment that the Constitution Act 1930, 95 years ago, imposed a constitutionally enforceable obligation on the provinces of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta to uphold the treaty promises to continue rights to traditional economies as a term and condition of Canada's transfer of control over lands and resources to the provinces of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. Paragraph 13 of the Memorandum of Agreement set out in the Natural Resources Transfer Act 1930 states in part, in order to secure to the Indians of the province the continuance of the supply of game and fish for their support and subsistence, the said Indians shall have the right which the promise hereby assures to them of hunting, trapping, and fishing game and fish for food at all seasons of the year. However, the result of this promise and this constitutional obligation is a persistent and significant gap between the acknowledged rights of First Nations to their traditional economies and the meaningful exercise of this right. The result is also decades-long systemic state-sanctioned infringement of the acknowledged right of top priority of First Nations to food sovereignty and the unjust enrichment of non-Indigenous persons who are beneficiaries of such infringements. We call on the expert mechanism, the permanent forum, the special rapporteur, and the voluntary fund to monitor, verify, and report on the status of state actions to constructively affirm the acknowledged right to traditional economies in order to secure the meaningful exercise of this right by Indigenous peoples. Kinanaskimit nao, miigwech, masicho.
Thank you. This is the last speaker what I can accommodate. I know there is overwhelming list. On behalf of EMRIP, I'd like to sincerely thanks to all the panelists, panel members for your valuable contributions, and all the delegates, representatives who made statements. Thank you so much for your collaboration and support. Have a good evening. See you tomorrow. The meeting has adjourned.
you.